Join me as we explore the power of ON1 Photo Raw's Brilliance AI. We're going to go over tips, tricks, and ways of tuning it and using it to get the best results on your images. Let's go. All right, so here we are inside of ON1 Photo Raw, and before we go like crazy deep into any of the settings, I just want to give an overview of what Brilliance AI is actually doing to the images. So if I click this little circle here, yours may be a different color than blue, and that's perfectly fine. That's just the accent color that I chose for ON1 when I set it up. It's going to default to 70% for me, and I'll show you how that's actually happening. Yours may default to 100%. I'll show you again how to fix this. And then you may have fine-tune minimized. To open it up, you can just click this little chevron or drop down arrow, whatever you want to call it. And you'll get two sliders here, one for tone, the other one for color. We're going to come back and talk about those here in a little bit. You also get local adjustments. Now, you can turn these off or you can turn them on by default, based off of what you choose to do. And what ON1 does is it uses the AI to find things in the image, and it applies a mask, 25% opacity for each of those things. And you can tailor this, and we'll jump into that as well here in a little bit. But maybe ON1 didn't select everything that you would have to actually adjust, and you can add more to it, I should say, by clicking on the regions here, and you can select the background. And if you hover over it, it's going to give you an overlay of what ON1 thinks needs to be selected based off of the feature that you select here. And if you don't see anything, then ON1 just isn't providing any masking capability to that AI feature, if that makes sense. But you literally just hover over these and you see which one you actually want to apply, which one you don't want to apply. And these masks are not 100% perfect, but you can always fine tune them and clean them up in the masking module. Now, the last thing that I'll show you in the overview is the options section. Now, this is a really cool portion of Brilliance AI, especially if you don't want to spend a whole lot of time trying to fine tune it. You can come in here and select the things that you want Brilliance AI to kind of manipulate for you. So right here, I have the method, which is Brilliance AI. But if I wanted to use the AI auto feature, this is the former version of the automatic adjustment tool that was found in previous versions of ON1. We still have access to that. A lot of people miss this because they think Brilliance AI is the only thing that they have access to. Sometimes AI auto is the right tool to use. And then we also have AI match. And I know a lot of people have asked me, Chris, where is AI match? Because they may have a camera profile that they fine tune and they want to match it as close to that profile that they shot in camera when they get into the raw workspace. And this is a way that ON1 is trying to match the camera profile from the JPEG reference that is embedded in the image. And if that sounds way too technical, don't worry about it. For those who are really looking for that AI match feature, then this is where it's at. And when you get to that point, then you know where it's at. That's all that you really need to know about this. Now, beyond that, we have the ability to change the white balance. And I want you to pay attention. Right now it's on white balance auto. Pay attention to the color amount slider up here. When I click as shot or hover over as shot, notice that I get a warning saying auto white balance required, and the color amount slider inside of fine tune is grayed out. That means that I'm not going to be able to manipulate that. So I want you to pay attention to that, because if you are having issues with the color and you're like, hey, Chris, I don't understand why I'm not getting the color slider available to me to adjust Brilliance AI, the reason is probably because you don't have auto selected, right? That is a requirement. And we'll talk about that here in a little bit as well. And then you can just hover through these and get a presentation or representation of what each one of these white balances are going to do to your image. In most cases, you can leave this on auto. And if you need to change it later down the line because you got your white balance right in camera, you could leave it to as shot, and you could do that in the tone and color section like you would normally be able to edit the image. So I don't need to spend too much more time on that, but we will come back to that. And then of course we have no noise AI, and I have it set to auto. You can have it set to on or off, but I'll show you why I have it set to auto when we get to the preferences. And then of course, retouch large faces. You get two options. You can turn that on or turn it off. For this particular image, it's irrelevant, but I do shoot a lot of portraits and sometimes I want to have that turn on. So I turn it on by default and then I turn it off later because most of the time I do want that to turn on. Now, let's jump into the preferences so we can make a little bit of sense out of what's happening over here with the Brilliance AI window now that we have a pretty decent overview. I'm going to hit Command and comma on my keyboard. That brings up my my preferences, not my Brilliance AI preferences yet. And you can see my accent color is blue here. I talked about that earlier when I was selecting it. You can change it to any of these colors here. I'm just going to come to the far right tab. Now, for those of you who are on a Windows machine, you'll actually come up to Edit, and then down at the bottom, you should have Preferences. For those of you on a Mac, you can use the keyboard shortcut Command and comma, or you can come up to where it says ON1 Photo RAW 2025, or if you have the 2024 version, this will still work for you. And you can click on Preferences. That brings you to the exact same window that I'm at right now. And then we're going to come to the very far tab that says Brilliance AI. Now, this window is extremely helpful and powerful in getting the right selections of the Brilliance AI tool for your images. You're going to have to test this on a lot of images. I personally tested this over, I think, 50 images, and that sounds like a little bit, but in the relative space of, editing. But for me, 50 images was a really good sample size of what I normally photograph, which is usually macro, portraits, products, and some animals, right? Lots of squirrels and birds. I like those. And then plants. All right. Those images, I found about 50 of them that made sense for what I needed ON1 to do for me as far as the Brilliance AI goes. And so that's what I tested on and tuned it to. And that's where I got to the settings that we're about to go over. So I just want to give some brief background to what that was, how that came to be, and all that good stuff. All right. So first thing is that white balance by default. Again, I have mine set to auto. If you change this to anything else, remember you're going to lose access to the color slider over here in Brilliance AI. Now, what you'll also lose access to in Brilliance AI, as far as like the Brilliance AI taken into consideration, is the temperature and vibrance, because both of those are going to be part of that color value. All right. If you disable color amount, and I'll show you that in all practicality here in a little bit, but if you do anything to disable the color amount slider inside of Brilliance AI, which is over here, you will not be using Brilliance AI to adjust the color. And that could be something that you want, since ON1 does give us a lot of powerful color tools. So that's a choice that you have to make. But for me, I usually am okay with a little bit of the color adjustment that ON1 does. And I'll again show you how I kind of use that to fine tune it for my photos. Then I have apply no noise AI to to raw photos above. And then you get to choose a number here. This number is going to be different for every single person. Now, you only get to go up to 6,400. That's the highest that you can, I guess, the threshold, maybe we'll call it the lowest threshold to not activate no noise AI. Because if a photo goes above 6,400 and you have this set, then it's going to activate. The other option is you could make it to where no noise AI does not turn on. Now, for me, I'm usually okay with images at 1,600 or less. The cameras that I'm using, they do a pretty good job at managing the noise signal in the image. So I don't really have that issue. However, if you are having an issue where you say, hey, 1,600, my images don't come out looking good and I need the noise to activate at 1600, then you go ahead and click that. If you want it to activate even lower, like maybe 800 ISO, if you have an older camera and 800 ISO is just not tolerable for you and you want no noise AI to turn on, then this is where you would select that number. And then any image shot at 800 ISO or above, then no noise AI will turn on. And to be clear, you still get the ability to change the luminance value and the sharpening and all that stuff inside of the no noise AI tool. However, what you're really telling ON1 to do is if the image is shot above a particular ISO, I want you to turn it on. And if it's shot below a particular ISO, just disregard that. Don't turn on no noise because I don't need it, or I don't really care to have it. And you still get the ability to go and turn it on or off later. I'm going to leave mine set to 3200 because that's where I like it. Then we have the Apply Portrait AI to Prominent Faces. This is the tool that turns on Portrait AI. And if you are photographing faces, people, then maybe it makes sense to have this turned on regularly. I personally do because a lot of my images are of my kids, family, and some friends. So it just makes sense for me to turn this on. I do find Portrait AI to be helpful in most situations. So I leave it turned on. And then we get to the fun part. All right. Now, again, this is where you really have to test and see what gets you as close to okay or acceptable for you. And that's all subjective. Everyone's going to have a different opinion and a different feeling. All right. But this is where you have to make decisions for your images. The first one is the overall strength. Just like the amount slider in pretty much any of the other filters inside of ON1, you get to choose how strong you want that applied to your image. All right. And I'll show you what this amount slider is really doing when we get into more of the demonstration of Brilliance AI. And then we have the midtone slider. And I like to boost my midtones just a little bit. So I made this a value of 1. But again, I'll still have the ability to go in and fine tune it per image. That's one of those sliders that I'll touch every now and again. But most of the reference images that I tested on, the moving at 1 click or whatever, the value of 1 gave me the closest reference to what I found I was always doing with the midtones. And then, of course, I like contrasty images, so I increased my contrast. I pushed that up. Now, you could go crazy, you could go less crazy. This is completely subjective, and it has to be, like, I can't stress enough, you have to figure out what works best for you and your images and what you like in your style. Brilliance AI is a tool that you have to tune and give it information so that way it can do what you want it to do. All right. Then we have the temperature slider. And the temperature slider, as I mentioned earlier, if you are not set to auto white balance, it's not going to do anything to your image. But if you are, then I tend to like my images to be a little bit on the cooler side. Sometimes I'll warm them up or I warm up particular areas of the image. But overall, most of my images, I like to be on the cooler side of the temperature spectrum. And then we have vibrance. And I normally like to add in a little bit of vibrance. And these are for those less saturated colors. It just kind of brings up the saturation in those areas. I enjoy using the vibrance slider a lot when we're working with develop raw. All right. And I guess now is a good time to make that connection. All of the settings that I just talked about are only going to modify things inside of the develop and the local adjustments tab. Now, for the local adjustments, you can choose to either apply them automatically or you can turn them on if you find like, hey, maybe Brilliance AI can apply some local adjustments. This, again, is a personal preference. Sometimes I find them helpful, sometimes I don't. So what I do is I leave them on because I know that I'm going to have to fine tune each image anyway, because Brilliance AI is not like a one-click finish for me. Instead, it's more like I'm going to get you 90 to 95% of where you want to be on your raw edit. So then I can get to the creative stuff a lot faster because that's where I like to spend my time. Now, for some of you, Brilliance AI may be the place where your images are completely done as soon as you click that button, and that's great. But for me, that's not exactly how it works. So now that I have all of my preferences set, let's hit OK. We're going to come over here to Brilliance AI. Now, I'm going to minimize this option slider for a second so that way we get a little bit more real estate. I'm going to turn on tone and color. And I'm going to hide camera profile because Brilliance AI does not impact the camera profile. All of the things that Brilliance AI impacts, and it also doesn't impact purity, all of the things that Brilliance AI impacts are showing on the screen now. And as I move the amount slider, I want you to pay attention to what's happening to all of the sliders. So if I pull it to the right, you can see what it's doing to those sliders. Don't worry so much about what it's doing to the photo. Obviously, we do care about that later down the line. But what I really want to show you is this is like your strength slider of the entire tool. All right. As you move the amount slider back and forth, you can see how aggressive it's working these sliders down here. Now, like I said, I tend to like mine around 70%. For this image, I'll probably say 68 is probably a good start. And then we have the fine tune tool. So again, if yours is minimized, just click the little drop down arrow there. It's going to pull up these two options, and making sure that you have white balance set to auto, then you will be able to adjust the color as well. Now, if I pull both of these fine tune sliders all the way down, I am literally back to the raw photo as it was ingested into ON1. The amount slider isn't doing anything to this image anymore. Brilliance AI isn't doing anything to this image. If I turn off and turn on, let me turn off the local adjustments. There we go. Because someone would be like, well, look, you turned off the preview and it was doing something. Yeah, I had local adjustments. So if I turn off the preview, turn it on, you can see it's not doing anything to the image when you pull down the tone amount or the color amount. And as I start to pull up on the tone, you can see it's moving the sliders there. And I'm starting to get the tonal adjustments in the image again. Then, of course, I can pull the color amount up and you can see that my vibrance slider is moving and the temperature slider is also moving. All right. Now, I want to show you something that I noticed about Brilliance AI and why those numbers kind of matter and how you can really tune them more appropriately for your image. As I pull the tone slider up, watch what happens to my midtones. So I'm at a value of 3 on the tone amount, and I've already hit my value of 1. Now, as I pull this up a little bit more, we're going to wait until we get it to 2 on the midtones. So it's about 9. So essentially, it's not an exact number, but roughly close to every 5 increments. And I say roughly because it's not a perfect number, but roughly close to every 5 increments on the tone amount slider, it's moving my midtones appropriately by 1 point or 1 value. All right. So if I pull this all the way up to 30, we'll go to 30. I'm at about 5. All right. It should be 6 if it was a 1 to 5 ratio, but that's essentially what's happening here. And the power of this is if you could figure out the ratios of what you want your images to have as far as each of these exposure and all that, you could really tune Brilliance AI like finitely, relatively. Now, you don't have to do that because the whole point of Brilliance AI is to simplify your ability to edit images. That's what it's supposed to do. So I'm not encouraging anyone to sit here and get out the calculator and start doing math, but I do want you to have an understanding that all of these sliders are connected proportionately to the amount. Now, let's say I go ahead and pull up my midtones like crazy, and I move my amount slider around, it's locking in the value that I just increased the midtones to. And eventually it's going to max out the midtones at 100. And I haven't even gotten close to maxing out the tone amount. So as I move that up, you can see the midtones are just staying at 100 and everything else is moving, but the midtones aren't. So I think that that's important to understand, that you can override like the relative position of each of these sliders as you fine tune your photos. Now, that's the benefit of using Brilliance AI. I think the marketing for it is one click and your images are instantly toned. And sure, I'm not knocking that as a value proposition for Brilliance AI, but I think what a lot of people miss is you can come in here, and let me just reset this. It's going to reset to my preference values, by the way. So whenever you hit the reset button, it's going to reset to that. When I say, you know what, I think I want this image to be a little bit more contrasty than, the other photos that I make, I can just push the contrast until it gets to a point where I'm like, okay, I think that that's fair. Then I can just move around the amount slider here and get this kind of fine tuned to what I want it to be. And it's going to move the contrast slider appropriately based off of the settings, the preferences that I have. But if, let's say for some reason, I'm like, you know what, the highlights just aren't what I'm feeling. So I can move my highlights around. And again, this is part of the whole fine tuning. So if I want to recover some of the information in the highlights, I could do that. And then maybe open up my shadows just a little bit more, and maybe even pull down on the blacks, or maybe open them. I don't know. We'll find out. All right. Now what I can do is I can pull the tone amount down, and I'm getting a proportionate adjustment for just the tone amount. Hopefully that's making sense. And if it's not, let me know in the comment section below, because my goal is not to confuse. I definitely want to help people see what is happening with the Brilliance AI tool as you edit through your images and you refine it. And there's a lot of capability that's in here. Now, I mentioned the local adjustments. Let's go ahead and click on those. So you can see that ON1 created a few local adjustments for me. One for flora and then one for sky. So if I open up the flora, it sets it to 25%. I haven't seen ON1 go above 25% by default whenever it applies. So that's interesting. If you're seeing a different level, please let me know in the comment sections, because I think that would be cool to know. But you can see it's reading let's see what it's identifying as flora. Okay. So essentially all of this grassy area and the trees, it's reading that as flora, as to be expected. And it's applying a highlight recovery to those areas. So if I turn this off, turn it back on, you can see it's just bringing out some of the information in those areas. And it's also increasing the vibrance, and it's moving the tint. Now, if I don't like the tint adjustment, which I really don't care for that, I'm just going to go ahead and pull that back over and then pull down on the vibrance. And you can see how easy it is to just come in and fine tune the look of what's going on in your images. Now, let me show you how I would use this in all practical cases. All right, let's just refresh it, or I'm sorry, reset it. So in this image, I feel like the sky is probably way too bright overall. So I'll adjust that as a local adjustment later. But for the entire as a whole, I think it has all of the dynamic range that I need. So for this image, I probably wouldn't adjust anything. But for the sake of showcasing, let's say I really wanted to open up some of the shadow area, like over in this area. I think that there's enough detail there, but I want a little bit more detail. So I'll pull up on my shadows, and I'll probably pull back on my midtones just to balance some of that exposure out again, right? And then this is where, I'll pull it down on my exposure, maybe just a little bit. And I think that overall, that's looking pretty good for what I would do. Now, when it comes to the color, what I like to do is pull the color slider all the way down and then just slowly work it in until it gets to a point where I like it. And I'll hold down the backslash key, turn it back on, and I'll probably increase the vibrance because, like I said, I really do enjoy pulling up on the vibrance. And then I'll pull back on the saturation. And I think that that's balancing out the scene to what it was like when I actually shot this. So turn it off, turn it back on. I think that that looks pretty good. And now I know that most of my issues are happening in the local adjustments. So I'm just going to go ahead and turn the local adjustments off and turn them back on. And I'm getting, again, a green hue or a green tint. We seen that earlier. So I'll come over to my flora and I will pull the tint back towards magenta because I don't want that green hue. Again, completely subjective, right? Or a green tint, I should say. And then I'll pull down on the vibrance because I don't think I need that much vibrance in those areas. And then I think it was recovering the highlights. Maybe I'll just reset that to 0 because I don't think I need to recover any of the highlights. And I'm okay with the structure adjustment there. So turn it off, turn it back on. And I think 25% is probably the most appropriate for this adjustment. I could pull it up and, that's kind of helping with the image, but those areas aren't really that important to the image. They're just there as reference, like that. The bridge is probably the main feature that I'm trying to showcase. And now I'm ready to really start working deeper on this image. I could continue working with the sky, but I think I like what it's doing to the sky. It's just bringing back a little bit of the blues in the sky, and I appreciate that. I actually like what it's doing there. So I'm not going to mess with that any further. So this is what I came into the editing window with. After using Brilliance AI, this is what I would go into my next step, or what I would continue going a little bit further of editing the bridge, maybe darkening everything else around it. So let's see if I can make that happen really quickly. So we'll click here and I want to come to mask and we'll click on architecture, and that's not going to get me what I want. So instead of that, we'll just use a brush. I'm going to do this really rough. So increase the exposure and I'm just going to paint over the bridge. And mind you, I do have a low opacity from a different project that I was working on, and that actually works out pretty well for what I'm doing here. All right. So we'll say that that is good. I'm going to go right click, copy the mask, add, we'll paste this, invert. And now everything else is dark, but I don't want everything to be completely dark. So we'll just pull down a little bit like so. And now the bridge is kind of the main feature. I did that very crudely. I would work this in a lot better, a little bit more detailed, maybe even taper off some of the shadow to highlight transition over here. But that's not what this video is about. This video is really just to show you that you can develop your images using Brilliance AI. And that's ultimately what I was doing. So hopefully this helped answer the question on Brilliance AI, how to fine tune it, and how you can use it for your own images. If you got questions, let me know down in the comment section below. Of course, if you want to learn how to use ON1 Photo Raw in a personal workflow, consider signing up for a one-on-one coaching call with me, where I take the time to help build a workflow specific for you. So based off of what you tell me that you need, I build that workflow for you or show you how you can use ON1 for your own workflows. I also answer any questions that you may have about the software. So if that's something you're interested in, check the description box below. There's a link for that. And then last but not least, if you want to save some money over at the ON1 website, when you shop there, consider using my coupon code FreeWillPhotos20. And until next time, I want you guys to stay inspired and keep creating. Peace.